able to introduce Dr. Yaakov Stern. And for those of you who don't know him, he is the Florence Irving Professor of Neuropsychology in the Department of Neurology at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He directs the Cognitive Neuroscience Division of the Department of Neurology. He's part of the Sergevsky Center and the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and Aging Brain. The reason we asked Dr. Stern to speak, he's a world leader in research on cognition and normal aging and diseases of aging, particularly Alzheimer's disease. He uses kind of classical neuropsychology, experimental neuropsychology approaches, and also both structural and, in particular, functional imaging in his research. He's very prolific. He's published over 500 peer-reviewed papers on a variety of topics. Some of the major topics, large-scale imaging studies to identify neural networks that underlie major cognitive abilities affected by aging, and also non-pharmacological interventions that might improve cognition or cognitive function outcomes in normal aging. And one of the major reasons we asked him to speak today, and the topic we asked him to cover, is cognitive reserve. And Dr. Stern is a pioneer in the study of cognitive reserve and its neural basis. He really helped to define the concept of cognitive reserve and its impact on the ability to detect early Alzheimer's disease. So he graciously has agreed to give us an update on his research on cognitive reserve. So Dr. Stern, take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here there with you. I think the talk will be a little short, so I think we can save questions for the end, unless there's something really pressing that I'm glad to interrupt. But you know, you've been through this before. You can type them in, and someone will point them out to me at some point, or we'll have Q&A towards the end. So, yeah. What I'll try to do is update you, and what I'd like to do is focus on some of the newer things we've been doing, but I'll cover some old ground as well. So let's start here. There's three terms that I like to use. I'll talk to you later about nomenclature, but these are terms that have been used by quite a few people over the years. The first term is brain reserve, which was really Katzman coined that term, wherein they saw in a nice paper, they saw 10 women that were part of the Bronx aging study who were cognitively normal, but at death had a lot of plaques. And they noted that these women had larger than average brain size, and they thought that they had something called they called it brain reserve. And I think what they meant were more neurons or synapses to lose. So that's why when we saw this other phenomenon of resilience in the face of pathology, that's why we called it cognitive reserve, because Katzman had already called this brain reserve. I guess if we started all over, we might use other words for these, but that's how it happened. So cognitive reserve is the resilience or plasticity of cognitive networks in face of disruption. And brain reserve and cognitive reserve, I'll show you, is more of an active process, brain reserve a more passive process. And brain maintenance was a later concept, which said that, you know, basically this group published it really about normal cognitive aging. And they said, you know something, a lot of the individual differences in severity of cognitive aging is due to differences in the degree to which the brain is maintained. Some people's brains just are maintained better than others. They don't change as much. And so I think that's a very nice flip side. So the amount of brain maintenance that you have could determine how much brain reserve you have at any point in time. In other words, the state of the brain. And then the cognitive reserve is resilience in the face of that disruption. So those are the three terms. This is from Paul Satz published this in 93. He was interested in this concept of threshold. So he posited this idea of brain reserve capacity. He didn't just mean the brain itself, he meant more than that. But in this paper, he talked about thresholds. So you can have one person that has more brain reserve capacity than the other, and if both of the people get the same size lesion, this person will fall below the functional impairment threshold and have problems. This person will not. And for me, that's a great parallel to brain reserve. Basically, they're talking about a fixed threshold after which you start to have deficit without any reflection on the brain that's left. So I wrote this review in 2002, and based off of that, I said, okay, you can have two people with the same amount of brain reserve capacity, or call it brain reserve, and one person can sustain a greater lesion than the other before they start showing impairment, because this person can cope with it better than this one, so they can tolerate more. So it's an active process of coping with brain changes that is cognitive reserve. Brain reserve is more of this passive concept. I'll get into controversies about nosology later. The early epidemiologic evidence, I won't go into a whole long thing, but some of the earliest things, and Katzman was really the first who suggested it, is that perhaps people with higher education or higher IQ are less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. So there's a whole set of studies showing delayed incidence of dementia in people with higher IQ, education, or occupational attainment, those who engage in more leisure activities. So that's with regards to Alzheimer's disease. Something that we found, more rapid progression of Alzheimer's disease in patients with higher CR proxies. So people with more reserve take longer to develop the disease, but once they get it, they decline more quickly. And the thought is because that pathology is already so advanced by the time that they develop the disease, they have less time to cope with it, and they actually die sooner as well. And then one that's a little more controversial is reduced slope of decline in cognitive aging in individuals with higher CR proxy. So now we're talking about normal cognitive aging, not Alzheimer's disease. And I'll show you in a second. We found that, some people have found that, but others have not. And that's been more of a mixed bag. How does cognitive reserve influence the slope of age-related cognitive decline, or does it, or do we just see intercept effects without slope effects? So I'll get back to that in a second. And this is my earliest paper. I didn't mention the term cognitive reserve in this paper, but this is my earliest paper about cognitive reserve. And as my friends know, my colleagues make fun of me because I always show it in any talk that I give, but I'm showing it for a good point here. So here, we're working with, I didn't know what to call it then, but we're working with neurodegeneration, so in the ATN concept, you have amyloid and plaques and amyloid and tangles, and then you have neurodegeneration, which can be measured either with volumetric kinds of approaches, but more better with FDG PET, where you see sort of loss of flow. In this paper, we were using xenon, which is another way to measure blood flow with a whole set of detectors on either side. And what we did here is we controlled for disease severity. So here you have, it was 20 people above high school, 20 high school graduates, 20 below high school, controlled for disease severity, like cognition, function, et cetera. And what we find is that in the people with higher education, more depletion, more neurodegeneration, especially at this parietal detector, tempoparietal detector. And what we took from that is that these people here, although they look the same clinically, these are all AD patients, although they look the same clinically, they have more Alzheimer's pathology in their brain. This has been replicated over and over again at this point in autopsy studies and imaging studies and the like. And the reason I like to show this is it incorporates the three key components if you want to look at cognitive reserve. So you have pathology or brain change, here is measured by this xenon uptake. Clinical outcome of the pathology, which is the Alzheimer's disease and the severity of Alzheimer's disease, the cognitive changes and the functional changes, and a moderator. And here we're using education as a moderator. And you need, if you're going to study cognitive reserve, really you need to have all of those three things in place, or make assumptions about them, because essentially you can view cognitive reserve as a moderator between brain change and the clinical outcomes. So that's something that is still under discussion today. I'm not going to talk about brain maintenance, but I like to show this paper. This is Chris Habeck, who's a long-term colleague of mine. It's important to understand, I introduced brain maintenance here, where some people maintain their brains better than others. And probably this brain maintenance is also influenced by lifestyles and activities, where lifestyles and activities and cognitive reserve might give people more resilience or plasticity. In other words, build up their flexibility. I'll get to that. But here, there might be aspects of lifestyle and activities that help maintain the brain. And the point that we wanted to make in this paper is that the same influences could be present in both cognitive reserve and brain maintenance. So this is cross-sectional data. So what Chris did here is he had a brain structure variable, which was made up of several different brain areas. And for each one, he looked at the 10 years surrounding any person, and he looked to see whether they were above average or below average. So this person here is a little bit above average, 0.33 above the average for her age. And he did that for 3 modalities: cortical thickness, volume, and white matter tract integrity, and averaged that into one brain maintenance variable. So basically that variable is how well is someone's structural brain intact compared to people their age. It's a proxy for brain maintenance. Proxy for cognitive reserve, he used a residual approach. So basically, if you predict cognition from brain measures like volume and thickness and white matter tract integrity and those things, you'll always have a residual. Bruce Reed and Dan Mungus were the first to show that residual, they threw in some demographic variables also, but that residual could sort of be a measure of how much reserve someone has. Someone who's doing better in the face of these will have a larger residual. So he did this again with four different cognitive functions: memory, fluid, reasoning, processing speed. He did it 4 times. He got 4 residuals. He showed that they were one unique latent construct, and that's our estimate of cognitive reserve. I'm going fast because that's not really so important. This slide, which is a very simple one, I think is the point I really want to make. So you have general cognitive reserve. He means by that cognitive reserve summarized across multiple cognitive domains, and you have brain maintenance. So cognitive reserve correlates with a NARD IQ of, word reading estimate of IQ. It correlates with education. Brain maintenance correlates with IQ and education. But cognitive and reserve and brain maintenance don't correlate at all. They're 2 separate things. Just because 2 things correlate with the same variables doesn't mean that they correlate with one another. And just because someone has high maintenance doesn't mean they're going to have high reserve. The same things influence cognitive reserve and brain maintenance, but probably not for the same reasons or in the same way. And I think it's just an important thing to keep in mind, because you can get tripped up if you don't have in mind that there are really 2 different things that could be happening to people simultaneously, probably are as we age. Although we can correlate them with common variables, those variables are acting on them in very different ways. Yeah, so when we first talked about cognitive reserve in relationship to Alzheimer's disease, and then Jennifer Manley was my postdoc then. Did she come from your place? Yeah. Yeah. She did her PhD in California and then came to me. And so in our Washington Heights study, she looked at cognitively normal elders. This is the Buschke selective reminding test. She separated people into high and low literacy. That was one of her early, very important insights, is that using education is okay, but the quality of education varies so much that it makes more sense to talk about literacy. And in this initial analysis, the people with high literacy showed less severe rate of decline in memory over time than the people with low literacy. And this has been replicated by some, not by others. Huge studies in the Scandinavian countries on large populations don't replicate it. And then we also see this intercept effect. So I just wanted to show you some new data of ours that I'm excited by. I'm doing this study that is looking at what Tim Salthouse calls referenceabilities. And Tim Salthouse, I'm sure many of you know, is one of the deans of cognitive aging, not an imager, but on the epidemiologic and cognitive side. And when he took large batteries of large neuropsych batteries, he could consistently form 4 latent variables that he found captured most of the variance in age-related cognitive decline. Other people divide them up differently: perceptual speed, episodic memory, fluid reasoning, and vocabulary. So in a study that I have, we're actually giving 3 tasks in the scanner from each of these 4 domains. I won't get into that. That's a whole other talk. The idea is, since these things form latent variables, can we find common aspects of task-related activation that are specific to each of those 4 domains? We call them referenceability neural networks. But anyway, so we have 3 tasks given in the scanner, and then we also have 3 tasks given on our neuropsych battery. So we have 6 tasks for each of these domains, and we can create a latent, now this is just working with the neuropsych data, a latent variable for reasoning, for memory, for speed, and for vocab. And we have 5-year follow-up on a subset of our sample at this point. So you can look at the latent variable at baseline for reasoning, at 5-year follow-up, and then look at the change in that and do these latent change analyses. How does performance change over time? And we have over 400 people in the study, but right now we have 250 about that we have 5-year data on. They range from 20 to 80. Follow-up is just about 5 years, the median certainly is. It's just as we planned. Their education is on average pretty high, but ranges from 11 to 24 years. What I don't have here is we really do have quite a bit of ethnic diversity in here as well. And these are data that are not published. We just submitted it recently. So sort of cool. These are summaries of the trajectories. You see each subject has a line. And you can see that, and here's age. You can see that there is this trajectory of decline for reasoning, for speed, and for memory. What this analysis shows is this inflection point where reasoning starts to take off and decline a little more quickly at about age 60 as the speed. Memory is declining, but takes off and goes faster at age 70. Very interesting, vocabulary actually increases over time in our hands. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of cross-sectional studies, including when we collected our cohort, we found that the older people had higher, this is NARD IQ, based on word reading. And people wonder, is that a selection bias? Is it a cohort effect? And I always thought that something like this would be the case, is that with this semantic kind of knowledge, you acquire it over time. So people really pick it up as they age, and you can see in people actually, their vocabulary increases over time, and then sort of peaks here at age 67. So that's I like that finding. Here's another way to look at the data. Here we have 5-year change for subjects, and here we have age, and you can see that the 5-year change is moderated by age. So the older you are, the more your reasoning declines, same for memory, same for processing speed. For vocabulary, it's a little different, I think, because you can see that what's really happening is that a lot of the people in the younger ages are acquiring, they're getting better, they're acquiring vocabulary. And by the time you get older, you're not acquiring it anymore. So I like that. And then this decline is not moderated by education. So we did not find differential rates of decline by education, but we do find differential rates of decline by IQ. So that here's change from baseline. This is now NARD IQ from 100 to 130. And you can see that for reasoning and for memory, but not for speed, that people with higher IQ show less decline after correcting for everything else. So you might, the thought would be, okay, those people with higher IQ have greater cognitive reserve against age-related brain change, right? But another alternate explanation for what we're showing is that the people with higher IQ have better brain maintenance. They're maintaining their brains better, so they don't show that change. So what we can do is look at 5-year changes in brain structure measures and control for those, or look at them. So first of all, we see equal amounts of decline in cortical thickness and volume and a few other brain measures as a function of age in people with differing IQs. And if we control for brain, we still see that the people with higher IQ are doing better over time. So now we can make a cognitive reserve kind of a statement that even though brains are changing, the people with higher IQ somehow are coping with it better and showing less of a severe slope of decline. So I think it's a nice implementation of those 3 key things that you need to have in order to study cognitive reserve.
Yaakov, to what extent do the same people would the same people be on all 3 of those curves in the same place, or are there differences?
You can't tell from this. You can't tell from these. We'd have to identify specific people in order to do that. Yeah, so I can't answer the question. Okay, who was that? Doug?
It was Doug.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't see your face, but I recognized the voice. Okay, that's no problem. Okay, and then here's another paper that's just under submission. That's okay. I just wanted to make sure I knew who I was talking to. Nice to see you. So here, a postdoc, Sharon Saint-Simon, looked at leisure activities. So we basically have this whole list of leisure activities, and what I'm showing you here is just total engagement in leisure activities. And bottom line is that engagement in leisure activities also moderates, looking at baseline, moderates change over time in reasoning, speed, memory, and vocabulary. I have to understand what's going on with that exactly, but even processing speed, which IQ did not. So these are very preliminary. This was just submitted. We'll see what the reviewers have to say about that. Okay. So I was convinced about the idea of cognitive reserve very early. And then the question is, okay, how do you study it? I really want to understand how it's implemented. And I have to say that there was 2 ways I could have gone. One would be more cognitive experimental. I am a neuropsychologist. I wouldn't, now I could say I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but really I was trained as a neuropsychologist. So you could have tried to create good cognitive tasks that really get at the implementation of cognitive reserve. And I'll show you a bit of that towards the end. But really I was seduced, I think, by the fact that functional imaging was picking up. First we had Xenon, then we had O15 PET, and later fMRI. Showing my age here. And so I was very excited to use imaging to understand the neural implementation of cognitive reserve. So as we said, cognitive reserve is individual differences in how people process tasks that allows us some to cope better than others with brain changes or pathology. So that's the basic idea. And early on, and not so perfectly in the original Jins paper, but then in a subsequent paper in cerebral cortex, I came up with these 2 terms, which I sort of regret. because they're confusing, but what is the neural implementation of cognitive reserve? And I called one neural reserve and neural compensation. So I'll try to explain the difference between those two ideas. The neural reserve speaks to, in cognitively intact people, there's individual variability in the brain networks or cognitive paradigms that underlies task performance. So people do tasks differently. Some people are more facile, they can do it in different ways. Maybe they have great efficiency or capacity or flexibility. I'll show you how we can look at efficiency or these concepts. In other words, I mean, the story I always tell is when my daughter was in second grade and she was trying to remember 7 plus 6, and I was helping her with her homework, and I said, oh, here's how you should do it, 7 plus 3 plus 3. And she gave me one of those looks that kids give their parents. But the point is that, especially with math, you can see it, that there's multiple ways to do things, and perhaps people with more flexibility can do better once they're challenged by aging. So that's neural reserve. And I wanted I was going to say reserve, save the term compensation for something different. Interindividual variability and the ability to compensate for brain pathology's disruption of the standard networks by using brain structures or networks not normally used. So when you start to adapt something that you don't normally use, then I would call that compensation. Other people, like Roberto Cabeza and crew in Montreal wrote this paper, and they would call all of what I'm talking about here compensation. But that was what I thought. And so neural compensation could help maintain performance or even be involved with better performance. But I'll show you in a second example where compensation allows people to maintain performance, but more poorly, like a cane is compensatory. You can walk, but you're not going to walk as well as you did before. But at least you can still walk. So I've been doing this for a long time. Here's the study that I'm doing now. We are bringing in, we started with people 20 through 30 and 60 to 70, and we measure everything about their brains that we can in the scanner: gray matter volume, cortical thickness, white matter hyperintensity burden, tract integrity. We're getting amyloid and tau and all of that. We measure neuropsych and task performance in the scanner, and we have some cognitive reserve proxies as well. And then we give 2 tasks in the scanner. One is a Sternberg kind of working memory task, and one is a set switching task. And our intuition is that here you have brain changes, here you have cognitive outcome, here you have reserve as a moderator, that differences in how these tasks are done by people might actually moderate or mediate, might moderate the between brain morphology and cognition. And that's the game we've been playing for quite a while. Here's a series of papers we published quite a while ago already. So for those of you, this is the Sternberg task. You see 1, 3, or 6 letters. There's a pause of 7 seconds. Then you see a letter, and if once you saw, you say, yes, I saw it. If it wasn't one that was on there, you say, no, I didn't see it. And Sternberg showed that it takes longer. The more letters you're holding in your brain, the longer it takes to make this decision. And that's what we're showing here. It's a linear effect where the larger the set size, the longer the reaction time is to make that decision. People use this to look at, study the basics of working memory. I liked it because it imposed load on the brain. In other words, we're making the task systematically harder and harder. And can we learn something about what the brain does as we make tasks harder that gives us some insight into reserve? I've been talking with Roberto a lot. Roberto Cabeza is someone who really popularized the concept, before her, a lot of other people did too. Cheryl Grady, I think, was the first to really talk about it, as far as I know. But a lot of people looked at compensation, but what we're talking about is individual differences in compensation and how those might be. So basically, what we looked at here is during the this phase here where they're just holding on to the data. And using a multivariate technique, the first thing we did is fish out a set of brain areas whose increased in activation as the task got harder. And these are a lot of brain areas that have been associated with working memory. And basically what we saw is that the older people, unfortunately greater expression is down here, the older people are ramping up this network more than the younger people as it gets harder. So I would call that efficiency. They have to ramp up this network to a greater degree in order to continue performance. I would call that efficiency. The amount of work that's done is less efficient per the amount of the expression of this network. You know, with a much harder task, we could look at capacity. When we make a task much harder, we did it with working memory for shapes. We could show that older people could only ramp up that network to a certain degree, while younger people could ramp it up even higher if you really push them harder. And I would call that capacity. And so to me, that's an example of this neural reserve. It's a network that young and old use, but that the old people are a little less efficient. And then I'll show you how that relates to cognitive reserve in a second, the individual differences in that. Then we got a second pattern out of this multivariate approach. And bottom line is, I'll just say it, but that the older people expressed this network, the younger people did not. And the more that the older people expressed it, the worse they were doing on the task, the less efficient they were. So it was a big argument in our lab. So Eric Zarin, who worked with me, they said, you know, Yaakov, that can't be reserve because they're not doing better when they do it. So he called it dedifferentiation. So, but I said, well, maybe what's going on is there's something wrong that's disrupting the primary network that's forcing these people to use the secondary network. And it really is compensation, but a different kind of compensation. And then I had a new postdoc, Jason Stefaner, who actually took this idea seriously. He went and he looked within the areas in the primary network, and he found some spots within the primary network where the people, some older people showed volume loss. And basically the yellow voxel decreased gray matter density was related to increased expression of that second pattern. So it really was compensatory. The first network is damaged, the second network is expressed. So we could call that neural compensation. Now, what does that have to do with cognitive reserve? So Jason, this is really actual path. This is a summary of actual path analyses that Jason did with these data. So you have age-related changes. In this case, it's this volume loss in the primary network, which is causing lower efficiency or in the primary network, perhaps, and pushing people to use an alternate network, a compensatory network. And that's related to task performance, the slope of RT as we make the task harder and harder. And what Jason found is this path where the people with higher measured cognitive reserve, IQ and education, maintained efficiency, were less likely to compensate as the pathology group. So that's a classic. So here you got, so now we have the age-related pathology, we have the outcome, we have a moderator, which is not just cognitive reserve, but some differential use of a brain network. So this is sort of an early set of papers looking at this. But what intrigued me was this path, which I'll get back to, which is just again, measured CR here. So this is after all of that task-related activation is happening. Still, no matter what's going on here, the people with higher IQ still do better on the task, which made me start to think about task invariant kinds of cognitive reserve and networks, and I'll get back to that in a second. And now we're doing this longitudinally. So now we have 5-year follow-up data, so we can start to look at change in brain integrity, change in network expression, change in task performance, and all of that. So we are just seriously cracking into those change data on a much larger end than the studies that I showed you. I'm going to skip this. I'll just tell you that we could do the same kinds of studies using amyloid PET. Yeah, and we see evidence of efficiency and compensation. So, so here's what I showed you. So because of this path here, I got this bug in my brain, and I started talking to Chris Habeck, who I work with, and Jason. I said, there's got to be a way that we can look for a task invariant network. By task invariant, maybe there's something that people, let's say with higher IQ, do, that no matter what task, they're going to do it in a different way. They're going to have something that's going to help them do better in the face of cognitive decline, of brain change. So in here, remember I told you we're doing that referenceability neural network study. So we have people doing 12 different tasks. So we came up with this idea. Can we identify a pattern of cognitive reserve-related brain activity, let's call that IQ-related brain activity, that we see in 12 different tasks? So we have 3 processing speed tasks, 3 speed tasks, 3 reasoning tasks, 3 memory tasks, vocab. Can we find, and whose expression during performance of the tasks correlates with a cognitive reserve proxy? And since it's a task invariant, we could even go to a totally different fMRI task and look for that covariance pattern expression in that, and show that expression there correlates with IQ. And then our test of whether that would be a reserve network is whose utilization moderates the relationship between structural brain measures and task performance. So that was the thing that we tried, and I wouldn't be telling you about it if it didn't work. So this is Chris. This is key areas in a covariance pattern. These are areas whose activity covaries in a specific way. It was present in all 12 of the tasks. Its expression in all 12 tasks correlated with IQ. Actually, it was derived such that that was the case. And here we threw it into, we looked at it in our set switching task, and we found that there too, expression of that pattern in a totally different task that it wasn't derived in correlated with NORD IQ. And then our kind of test is, okay, it's correlated with IQ. Can we say it's related to reserve? So here's the kind of analyses that we've been getting fond of. We have a pattern of cortical thickness that as it gets thinner is related to poorer fluid reasoning. And here, this is the red people are the higher expression, the black are the lower expression. And we can see that the people, the higher the expression, higher expression of this task invariant network moderates the effect of thickness on reasoning. You can see for the lower expression, by the time the thickness gets very low, the reasoning is low. The people with more expression of this network can do a little better in the face of the cortical thickness loss. So we call that a reserve network. Is it the real reserve network? You know, for me, very often these are more like ideas. I can't claim that this is the only reserve network out there, but it's just a way of thinking about it. And then a few people have been doing the same thing with resting bold, usually with some network that they feel, some standard resting bold network that they feel might be, whose differential expression might be associated with reserve. There's a group in Munich that works with a left frontal network. Nico Franzheimer published a few papers. We decided to see if we could fish something out. This is a paper that we just finally got published within the last couple of weeks. So again, Chris, using resting bold now, found a pattern of connectivity, a covariance pattern of connectivity that correlated with IQ. He was able to bring that into a whole other population, a whole other set of data, and show that expression of that pattern in that other population also correlated with IQ. Which I think most people don't do usually is forward apply. And then we looked at whether, again, expression of this pattern moderated between thickness and cognition. So here, this is a global cognitive measure. And what we found here in the derivation sample, we did not find a moderation. So that expression did not moderate between mean thickness and cognition. But after accounting for mean thickness, this IQ connectome score also accounted for significant amounts of variance. And for memory, it did moderate. So we're making the argument that this might be a cognitive reserve network now measured on the connectome level. Okay, I'll just show you one more study. So I told you that I was always intrigued by the idea that can't we use cognitive experimental approaches? I'll just say that there's someone who's not muted, that there's a lot of noise coming from. Can we use cognitive experimental approaches? And the thing where I thought that that might be useful is flexibility of solution strategy. So can I find a task that goes towards flexibility of solution strategy? It's not as easy as you think. There's this guy, Patrick Lemaire, who does flexibility mainly with math-related tasks, a lot of it in child development. So we did some of his tasks, but anything to do with math really sort of spooks a lot of your participants. You're asking them to multiply. So I finally had this idea, and this guy, Dan Beruli, was a graduate student of mine who actually implemented it. And it comes to the matrix reasoning tasks. So I think most of you are familiar with matrix reasoning. There's 9 squares, but 1 is missing. And you have to guess from the choices below, determine from the choices below which is missing. And here the answer is this. And you can see that this requires like a visual strategy. Basically, just by looking at the shapes and how they're leaning, you can make that decision. And there's a whole literature on how you can classify matrices based on specific strategies that underlie them. So here, this is requiring a visual strategy. Here's another matrix reasoning task, which requires a logical analytic strategy. In this case, it's an AND strategy. This plus this is this, this plus this is this, then this plus this is which of them down here. And you could use and or XOR. Dan went, and there's some group that actually created a program that generates matrices based on criteria, and they had generated a bunch of these, and he had generated more, and he generated a bunch of these relatively simple matrices that either rely on a visual spatial strategy or a logical analytic strategy. And then what do you do with it? Set switching. So we have blocks of pure logical analytic, blocks of visual spatial. Then we have mixed blocks where they have to go back and forth between those two strategies. I mean, it's sort of simplistic, but really, usually set switching is, people switch from a capital small to vowel consonant decision, sort of very simple things. We're asking people to switch between strategies. So, but still, what happens to people in those mixed blocks as they have to switch should give us some insight into cognitive flexibility of solution strategy. And so he piloted this on Amazon Turk a few times, and we could show that older people, there's a lot of ways, for those who are familiar with set switching, there's a lot of ways to estimate switch costs. We could show that there were greater switch costs in the older people. And some of our measures of switch costs actually started to correlate with classic measures of cognitive reserve, like IQ. And then in the final experiment, he did this, again, it's an online task. So a bunch of people in my referenceability neural network study participated in this study online. And now we had brain data to work with. So first of all, we work with this measure. It's first of all, so better switch cost is correlated with higher IQ very strongly. And then we use this BIN score, not BIM, but BIN score. It's a very nice way of calculating switch costs. And you can see for memory, this BIN score moderated between cortical thickness and memory, so that there's an interaction such that the better your bin cost, the less the cortical thickness affected your memory. For reasoning, we didn't get moderation, but again, we had explained increased variance over and above that by cortical thickness, and we had that for cortical thickness. We did not get any kind of an effect for speed. So why am I excited by this? Basically, I think we have a handle on this concept that I wrote it in my very first paper in GINS on this flexibility of solution strategy. We have a task that can capture it, we can study it, and what I'm hoping, what we're starting to, can we image it? Because how do you image flexibility of solution strategy? You really have to know. So what my fantasy is, and we'll see, and call me back next year, I'll be able to tell you that I'm hoping that there's a specific activation pattern that we can fish out associated with visuospatial that's different than logico-analytic. And I'm hoping that we can actually, in these switch blocks, see how well people can switch between those two strategies. Now, I could be completely wrong. I've talked with other people who've tried to do similar stuff with working memory and stuff like that. What happens sometimes is that people during switch start to use a totally different activation pattern and surprise us. But anyway, I just think it's a very fun, more cognitive experimental tool to start to get at flexibility and solution strategy. And so that's new, just a submitted paper. We submitted it to Psychology and Aging. We'll see what happens to it. Yeah, so that's me. Of course, I feel that I understand what cognitive reserve is and what brain maintenance is, and I feel that brain reserve is an important concept. But out there in the real world, people are doing a lot of research in this area more and more all the time. And the nomenclature that people use and the terms they use and their definitions are widely divergent. And it's an issue. So as part of the Alzheimer's Disease International Conference, AAIC, they have these PIAs. I'm sure some of you, yeah, Doug, you have one on cognitive approaches. There's all kinds. So we have one that's a reserve and resilience protective factors PIA, and a work group from that PIA got together to create a white paper that defined those three concepts: reserve, brain maintenance, and cognitive reserve. And Bill Kremen was one of the co-authors of that paper. And I was pretty happy with it. We defined them and we gave sort of research guidelines. Then it turns out that the National Institute of Aging had these cognitive aging seminars, and they had one quite a few, maybe 6-7 years ago, on cognitive reserve. And Molly Waxter and John King, who are project officers in cognitive aging, saw that there was a lot of disagreement about these concepts, what to call them, how to measure them. So they called for they wrote a request for applications for they made up this word, collaboratory on research definitions for reserve and resilience and cognitive aging and dementia. And it was an RFA, and they asked to say, let's have some workshops to discuss it. Let's have work groups that'll discuss programmatic issues surrounding it. Can we develop data sharing? Maybe we can have pilot studies to validate proposed definitions and dissemination. So it's a kind of thing that usually, if I read it, I'd say, oh, I'm glad to be a part of that, but I don't want that grant. But because it was cognitive reserve, and I feel attached to it, I wrote it, and I have some really good people that are on the executive committee. And so what we've done is we got together a group. So the white paper really was mainly human investigators, one animal investigator. So we included animal investigators, and we had work groups of non-human investigators talking about these concepts. We already had 2 workshops. I didn't put the URL, reserveandresilience.com, AND. In the first one, we had like 30 odd people just talking about their concepts, and everyone had even if they used the term cognitive reserve, they had different definitions. Some people called it resilience. Some people called it something else entirely. The definitions of them were not straight. But at this point, we're getting quite close to a consensus document that, again, defines these terms, gives some research guidelines now that are applicable to both human and non-human research. We actually gave out 12 pilot studies where people are implementing those definitions. The last meeting will be at the end of September. It probably won't be in person. We were just talking about it before the talk, but I'm hoping that, again, it's just a wider degree of consensus over a lot more people This document has been edited that we're working on, I don't know how many times at this point, but it's a process of, and the other thing what we're doing is we're including a table. So some people don't use the word cognitive reserve. So they'll use the term resilience, but they'll define it just like cognitive reserve. So if their operational definition is exactly the same, I think that's okay. But if someone calls something cognitive reserve, but doesn't include a brain measure or implicitly a brain measure that you're modifying with reserve, you're coping with reserve, then it doesn't work and people are not communicating with one another. So I call it sort of the sociology of this problem. So yeah, so I'll stop there. Just quickly, epidemiologic and imaging evidence support the concept. It's malleable. Talking about two forms of reserve, brain reserve, which is passive and supported by brain maintenance, and cognitive reserve. It's applicable to a lot of things besides aging and dementia. We really need good life course studies to study it. We need imaging studies to understand the neural implementation. Accepted, consistent definitions will be helpful. And of course, the reason that we're interested in it is that influencing these concepts, reserve and maintenance, can delay or reverse effects of aging or brain pathology. So there's a very hopeful message behind it. So, okay, so I'll stop there and thanks everyone.
Yeah, but thank you very much. That was an outstanding presentation. I think it really catches us all up on cognitive reserve. So thank you very much, Yaakov, for doing it.
My pleasure. Thanks. And it was a chance for me to show you some stuff that we're just submitting. So that's fun to do also.
Yeah, very exciting data. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, take care, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.